Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Before beginning this trial, I am going to make a few comments about your role here today. As the judge in this case, it is my role to interpret and judge the law. As the jury, you are the judges of the facts, and it is your duty to assess the evidence that is presented by the witnesses today. In this sense, we might be said to function as a team. There are two other principles that are important to your role as jurors. They are the presumption of innocence and the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Activist is presumed to be innocent until the prosecutor has satisfied you beyond a reasonable doubt that he is guilty. The responsibility is on the prosecutor to prove each element of the crime Mr. Activist has been charged with beyond a reasonable doubt. Because of the presumption of innocence, Mr. Activist is not required to prove he is not guilty or to explain the evidence presented by the prosecution. Andy Activist is charged with one crime, a misdemeanor, and fined $2,000 as a result of placing on the front lawn of Perfect States Capitol building a 5x5 sign that had the following words and a Nazi swastika in bright red paint. In order for you to find Mr. Activist guilty of the misdemeanor, the prosecution must prove the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. That on February 2nd, 2012, Mr. Activist placed a 5x5 sign that read, "Recall Governor Patricia Pacifist. Her scare legislation is a criminal and unconstitutional," along with a swastika in bright red on the front lawn of the Perfect States Capitol building. Patricia Pacifist nor the Perfect State government approved this act of libel. To prove Andy Activist guilty, the prosecutor must prove Mr. Activist is indeed the one who planted the crude sign on the Perfect State government's lawn. The act of placing the sign on the Perfect State government's lawn is unconstitutional. The words said are not protected by the Constitution if said in the way it was. If the act is deemed unconstitutional, enforced under compelling reason post 9/11, the legal definition of libel, a published false statement that is damaging to a person's reputation or written definition. I will discuss these matters with you further in my charge to you after the prosecution and defense counsel have had their opportunity to present their cases. I now call the prosecution to begin their case.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and thank you for being here today. My name is Michael Troy, and I'll be the lead prosecutor in this case. Throughout this trial, there will come times where you feel sorry for Mr. Activist. The defense will tell you about the good things Mr. Activist has done, because the defense wants you to believe that his crime is justified. But that's not how the law works. There's a statue standing right outside of this very courtroom of a woman holding a pair of scales. This statue is of a beautiful woman, a woman named Justice. If you go up and look at this statue, you'll see that the woman is wearing a blindfold. This is because Justice doesn't care what Mr. Activist looks like or what drove him to commit the crime. Justice, ladies and gentlemen, only cares about the law. The ordinance in which Mr. Activist has been charged with is indeed constitutional, especially in regards to 9/11. I will prove that the words and symbols are clear and recognizable to the common citizen. I will also prove that the defendant's words are classified as fighting words, regardless of the ordinance, and therefore are not protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution. In support of my case, I will also be calling upon the arresting officer to testify that the defendant's rights were not violated under equal protections. Mr. Activist's personal beliefs do not matter. What matters is the fact that he committed a crime, and for this the justice must be served. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. My name is Colin Laffey, and I'm glad you're here today to bring proper justice to my client, Mr. Andy Activist. For the next 20 to 30 minutes, Mr. Troy is going to call people to the stand and have them testify with the sole intention to smudge the reputation of my client because he wants you to think he is a bad person. Mr. Activist is a good-hearted American citizen who, on the 2nd of February, was exercising his First Amendment rights to speak what he believes about Governor Pacifist and her past actions as a political leader. Mr. Activist is not in violation of Legislative Code Ordinance 123.4. He was doing nothing other than expressing his disapproval of our current member in office, and in no way intended to, or did say, or did anything to damage the reputation of Ms. Pacifist in a personal or political way. The words on the sign, "Recall Governor Patricia Pacifist and her scarce legislation is criminal and unconstitutional," are not fighting words, rather a simple political statement. I know all of you as United States citizens want your rights to be protected by our Constitution if you should choose to exercise them, and there is no reason why you should find my client deserves these rights stripped from underneath him. Thank you.
Is the prosecution ready to call its first witness?
Yes. Thank you, Your Honor. The prosecution calls the witness, Alexis Maciel, to the stand.
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your full name and address for the record.
Alexis Marie Maciel, 1236 Hartwood Drive, Rohnert Park, California.
Thank you. Ms. Maciel, what is your relationship with anti-activists?
We don't have a relationship whatsoever.
But you recognize him placing the sign on the lawn across from your store, Sif Twinkies?
I saw him for the first time that night and immediately called the police, where they came immediately and arrested him for the crime right in front of my store.
I see. What was anti-activists' behavior like when you saw him that night?
He seemed livid, non-cooperative. I heard him say he had done nothing wrong and he had the freedom of speech and that the police were stripping him of that right.
And what happened after he said that?
He continued to repeat himself and was eventually put in the cop car, where I couldn't hear what he was saying any longer.
So would you say anti-activist was behaving with erratic or wild behavior?
Objection, Your Honor. The question is leading.
Your Honor, I am simply attempting to recreate the scene for the jury for a better understanding.
Counsel, your objection is noted, but I will allow the question. The witness will answer the question, please.
So, like I said before, Alexis, would you say anti-activist was behaving with wild or erratic behavior?
Correct, he was.
So, Alexis, what exactly was anti-activist wearing when he committed this crime?
A blue shirt and a hat.
Thank you. Now I will show the surveillance footage of anti-activists placing the sign with the swastika on the lawn of the Perfect State Control Building, as well as anti-activists getting arrested by the Perfect State Police.
Hey, this is my right. This is America. You're arresting you. America. You're arrested. Yeah, next time, you shouldn't do things of that nature.
Would the defense care to cross-examine the witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, Ms. Maciel, you stated you saw my client, Mr. Activist, for the first time that night.
That is correct.
What exactly drove you to call the police on my client? What crime did you believe he was committing?
Well, I don't know the law in depth, but it was late at night and I didn't know what he was doing. It just looked suspicious, I guess.
I see. It's just that my client was simply placing a political sign on a lawn in front of a government building, which to most does not seem too out of the ordinary. I suppose you would not find it too fair if you were, let's say, out at the back of your store late at night and someone called the police for suspicious activity when you might just be taking out the trash or something of the sort.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
With no further questions.
Prosecution may now call its next witness then.
The prosecution calls Officer Sean Lang.
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your name and occupation for the court.
Sean Lang, Perfect City Police Department officer.
Officer Lang, do you recall the events that took place on the day of Andy's arrest?
Of course. I was patrolling on the corner when I heard hammering and shouting. I then turned to Main Street to find a protest sign on the front lawn of the Capitol building. I then approached and found a man sticking his picket sign in the lawn of the Capitol building.
Were there other protesters outside with anti-activists at the time?
Yes, there were. They were peacefully protesting with picket signs on the sidewalk out front of the Capitol building.
And what made Andy stand out to you at this point?
It was him hammering the sign into the Capitol lawn.
Could you please read for the court what Andy's sign said from this picture taken at the scene?
Recall Governor Patricia Pacifist. Her scare legislation is criminal and unconstitutional, end quote, and it has a swastika symbol drawn on it.
What was your reaction once you read this sign?
I was immediately shocked. The fact that Andy was not only shouting but hammering his sign into the ground made it perfectly clear that he wanted everyone to see his sign. Along with that, painting a bright red swastika symbol on his sign, clearly linking Governor Pacifist and her legislation.
So can we both agree that this sign was at all offensive?
Absolutely, sir.
Seeing all the protesters and watching Andy place his statement in the lawn of the Capitol building, what made you decide to approach and arrest him?
It was the fact that he was placing his sign into the lawn of the Capitol building. As I mentioned earlier, it was the vandalizing of public property that became an issue. Based on this fact, I approached Mr. Activist and ordered him to remove his sign from the public lawn. When he refused, I ordered once more before threatening arrest. When he did not comply, I placed him under arrest.
Okay, so you say your decision to approach and arrest Mr. Activist was based purely on the fact that he was breaking the law, and your decision had nothing to do with gender or race or his beliefs of that matter, thus breaching the Equal Protection Clause?
Absolutely.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
The defense is now free to cross-examine the witness.
So, Mr. Lang, as a police officer, you've probably seen many protests.
Yes, a few times.
And have there been protesters with signs?
Yes.
How about this protest? Were there other citizens protesting with signs?
Yes, but however, none of them were hammering their signs into the lawn.
So the only reason you arrested Andy is because his sign was in the ground instead of held in his hand?
This is correct. I was following ordinance.
So what if the other protesters had just rested their signs in the ground? Would that be a reason to arrest them? Or is there a certain level the wood must be in the ground for you to arrest them? Help me out here. Is it very unclear?
Objection, Your Honor. Badgering the witness.
Sustained.
No further questions.
The defense may now call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense would like to call Mr. Ethan Gallego to the stand.
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I did.
Please state your full name and address for the record.
Ethan Gallego, 865 Mitchell Avenue, Runner Park, California.
Thank you. Please inform the court of your occupation.
I'm a constitutional lawyer working for the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. We discuss an array of legal and public policy issues and work to make a difference in legal and public policy debates.
Can you please read aloud for the court point C from the RAV versus St. Paul Supreme Court case? Just the first sentence is fine.
The ordinance, even as narrowly construed by the state Supreme Court, is facially unconstitutional because it imposes special prohibitions on those speakers who express views on the disfavored subjects of race, color, creed, religion, or gender.
Mr. Gallego, in your professional opinion, as a constitutional expert, do you think that the Ordinance 123.4 is an unconstitutional restriction on the right to free speech?
Yes, I do. And this is because the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. The Ordinance 123.4 takes away the right to peaceably assemble, petition, and exercise the freedom of speech. Although this law attempts to prevent the destruction and devastation of events such as 9/11, it does not give the government jurisdiction over people outside of the United States. Laws are already in place that give authority to officers to prevent terrorism inside the United States. Overall, I believe this ordinance suppresses U.S. citizens' rights including Mr. Andy Activist's rights, which were breached under his First Amendment rights and under his equal protection rights as written in the 14th Amendment.
Can you please elaborate on how his equal protection rights were violated?
Well, from what I've heard, the defendant was the only one arrested, even though many other people held picket signs besides him. And the only excuse the officer had was that he put his picket sign in the lawn. It seems to me that there was obviously no compelling reason to implement this unconstitutional ordinance because, in fact, these protesters were just practicing their First Amendment rights. They are not terrorists, they are just unhappy with government practices. The fact that we are, as Americans, able to protest the government we are not satisfied with is what makes this country so great in the first place.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Prosecutor, the witness is yours.
Mr. Glago, did you read in full the decision made for the RAV versus St. Paul U.S. Supreme Court case?
Yes.
And would you say that a swastika is a symbol that could, quote, arouse anger, resentment, and insecurity in a reasonable person?
Well, yes.
And would you also say that since the events of September 11th, there have been more precautions taken to avoid terrorist threats all throughout the United States? For example, a major increase in airport security?
Yeah.
So there's more obvious fear of terrorism now as opposed to pre-9/11.
Correct, I would agree with that.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
The defense may now call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Zach Taylor to the stand.
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your full name and address for the record.
Zachary Taylor, 6940 Jasmine Circle, Runner Park, California.
What is your relationship with Mr. Activist?
Andy and I go way back. We met in junior high and we've been pretty close ever since.
So how would you define Andy as a person?
He's an amazing person. From being our high school class president to doing countless hours of volunteering, aiding impoverished children, I could never in a million years picture my good friend Andy being accused of such hateful acts. Just this past year, Andy and I were part of an immersion trip with our church to Ghana, where we assisted many doctors in the villages with the fight against malaria. Andy does whatever he can to do his part and give back to the community. Really a person with and for others.
When you heard about Andy expressing his political opinion on the front lawn of the Perfect State Capitol building, to your best knowledge, do you believe he was doing so with any malicious intent?
Objection, Your Honor. The question is ambiguous.
Your objection is noted but overruled. Prosecution, please continue. The defense.
Please answer the question.
No, I do not believe he intended to cause any harm.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Mr. Troy, the witness is yours.
Mr. Taylor, did you happen to see the sign that Andy placed on the front lawn of the Capitol building?
Yes, I did.
So you could say you're pretty familiar with what was, portrayed on the sign?
I suppose you could say that.
Alright, so when you and Andy, you went to school together all those years, did you guys happen to cover World War II at any point?
I'm sure we did.
With this general knowledge of World War II that you gained from school, would you consider the Nazi Party to be a hateful group?
Yeah, I would.
And would you say that the Nazi Party and symbols associated with are fairly recognizable to the majority of citizens?
Yes, I suppose.
Would you also suppose that Mr. Activist would have some sort of the same understanding that you do to these discriminatory references?
I mean, yes.
So even though Andy clearly knew that these words were associated with the swastika and that they were harmful, he decided to go through with associating Patricia Pacifist with the swastika, proposing that she herself was affiliated with the Nazi Party?
Well, like I said before, Andy is a good guy. I trust him with my life. Sure, maybe he did not put a swastika on there. So what? He didn't hurt anyone. He was just enacting the right of freedom of speech.
No further questions for this witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may now step down. Mr. Activist, would you please take the stand?
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
please state your name and address for the record?
Andy Activist from Rohnert Park, California.
And Andy, where were you the night of February 2nd?
I was at the Capitol building. Yourself?
At home abiding the law. Anyways, this trial is about you, Mr. Activist, so you were there, and it was you who was handling the sign to the Capitol, correct?
You bet it was me.
So then you admit it was you, in fact, who slandered the good name of Patricia Pacifist by trying to associate her with such a heinous group as the Nazis?
I did, and it's my right. I'm from America, land of the free, home of the brave. And I'm brave enough to stand up for what I think is right. And under the First Amendment, I am protected to enact upon what I feel as a U.S. citizen.
So I see you think you can go around just calling anybody a Nazi and have no repercussions for your actions? Never have to stand up for yourself? Just hide behind a sign, Andy? Real brave of you.
Objection, Your Honor. The question is ridiculous and only intends to deface the reputation of my client.
Sustained. And I would ask that you please use respect when addressing the witness further.
No further questions, Your Honor.
The defense rests its case.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. The testimonies we have heard here today have proved that the ordinance Mr. Activist has been charged with is indeed constitutional. This particular ordinance encompasses a variety of acts, but in no way tries to include too much. The words and symbols present on the sign that Mr. Activist placed on the Capitol lawn were recognized by the common citizen to associate with hatred and resentment. These fighting words were directed at Patricia Pacifist and were especially alarming after the events of 9/11. Such words and symbols are perceived differently after the attacks because the common citizen's fear of terrorism has grown so much. There is no question in this matter, after hearing all the testimonies and in this case, that the Legislative Code 123.4 is constitutional, especially in regards to 9/11, and therefore the charges against Mr. Activist should not be dismissed. Thank you.
Your Honor, members of the jury, thank you for hearing this case with your utmost attention today. I, along with everybody in this courtroom, am aware of the tragedies our great nation faced 13 years ago. Tragedies that will never be forgotten. The reason this nation is so strong is a combination of two things: the adversities which it has faced and our backbone, our structure, our Constitution. Time and time again we have been hit with diminishing blows, but we have overcame those obstacles and came out stronger on the other side. But most importantly, we have held true to our Constitution and did not reword a piece of paper to easily solve the issue. Ordinance 123.4 is unconstitutional, as our Constitution experts stated, because it violates our basic First Amendment rights. This has been discussed in the highest of our court systems and was previously deemed unconstitutional. Our witnesses have testified to explain that my client is not a bad person, was not doing anything wrong, and was being a model citizen of America by exercising his rights. These charges should be dropped and he should be released immediately. Thank you.
Heard all the testimony I'm prepared to hear today. The court is now adjourned. We will meet again in 1 week and I'll render my verdict. Thank you very much.